We're going to the hidden front, that moral gray zone of World War II. A
Mhm.
landscape where the very rules of warfare were just swallowed by the snow, and the line between executioner and liberator, it vanished in a sheet of ice. This is Hidden Front history. Today we're doing a deep dive into a truth that was deliberately actively suppressed by one of the most celebrated, one of the most complex, and maybe one of the most protective generals in American history, George S. Patton.
That's right.
This story isn't about the tanks breaking through or, the famous speeches in front of the flag. No, it's about a document, a fireplace, and a decision that was made in about 10 silent seconds. A decision that protected a war crime and, well, it stained the moral high ground of the American war effort for decades to come.
And to really feel the weight of this moment, you, the listener, you have to picture the scene. I mean, we need to set this up precisely. The date is January 4th, 1945. It's 9 o'clock in the morning. The location is the Third Army headquarters, which is housed in this freezing converted stone chateau in Luxembourg. And General Patton, the man who had just, saved the entire Allied line at Bastogne, is standing there, warming himself by a roaring fire. He is the undisputed master of this entire theater.
Yeah, he's on top of the world, professionally speaking. The narrative we always hear puts Patton right there as the savior, the relentless force of will. But on this particular morning, a different kind of authority walks into that room. A major from the Inspector General's office. And he's clearly uncomfortable carrying this thick manila folder, stamped right on the front, ominously, top secret.
And what's inside that file is not intelligence about German troop movements. It is sworn evidence that was gathered rapidly, meticulously. We're talking ballistic reports, location data, names, and even civilian testimony.
So it's an open and shut case.
It's an ironclad case detailing a mass execution. A mass execution committed not by the Waffen-SS, but by American soldiers. It is the proof that the illusion of, let's call it American moral purity, in the good war is already shattered.
The major places the file on the desk. He's expecting the classic Patton explosion, right? The famous rage, followed by immediate orders for a sweeping court-martial.
Of course, that's what should have happened.
But it's not what happened. Instead, Patton turns from the fire, he looks at the file, then he looks back at the fire again. And in that pause, in that silence, he makes a choice that involves him, personally, committing a felony.
A serious one.
So our mission in this deep dive is to analyze the sources, to understand the crushing psychological environment that allowed American soldiers to become executioners, and critically, to really dissect the calculus of command that led General Patton to obstruct justice and destroy the evidence. Okay, so to really appreciate the decision that Patton made on January 4th, we have to immerse ourselves in that environment. The Battle of the Bulge, late 1944, early 1945. And this was not, the sunny, fluid war we imagine from the summer campaign across France. What do the sources tell us about just the physical conditions these troops were facing?
The sources are. They're just relentless is their description of the misery. This wasn't just a cold winter. It was, according to the meteorological records, the coldest winter in Western Europe in 30 years.
30 years, wow.
30 years. So the temperatures were routinely dropping to 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and very often much lower than that. This physical reality, this cold, it dictated everything. It was the backdrop to every single decision and action.
And that kind of cold, that's more than just discomfort. It's a structural enemy, isn't it? It's actively fighting you.
It is an active combatant. 100%. It wasn't just men suffering from frostbite, which was rampant. I mean, turning skin black, leading to amputations, that was common. The cold actually seized the war machine itself.
How so?
The machine oil froze in the automatic rifles. Cheap engines just wouldn't turn over. Artillery pieces were mired in frozen mud. Simple survival. Just staying alive. It consumed all the energy and mental bandwidth of every single soldier.
So you can't even fight effectively. You're just trying not to die from the weather.
Exactly. Near Bastogne, we have these accounts of men stuffing their boots with burlap sacks, tearing apart abandoned civilian furniture, just to maintain a small fire that might last them through the night. The war was literally freezing their ability to fight, or even think straight.
And the sources make this crucial distinction. The physical cold was terrible, but it was secondary to what they call the psychological terror that was gripping the American lines. So how did the nature of the German offensive create this deep paranoia?
Well, this is where the real descent into chaos began. The offensive itself was a shock, a complete surprise. But the most psychologically corrosive factor was something called Operation Grief.
Operation Grief. What was that?
This was a German strategy executed by Autoskorzny's commandos. They took specially trained troops who were fluent in English, dressed them in American uniforms, and had them drive captured American vehicles to infiltrate the lines.
Oh, man.
Their mission was sabotage, confusion, disruption, create total chaos behind the lines.
So the enemy isn't just the guy in the gray uniform in front of you. The enemy might be the man asking you for directions at a crossroads.
That is the terror of it. And rumors, fueled by very real incidents, they spread like wildfire through the foxholes.
Yeah.
Stories of, American sentries getting their throats slit by men wearing familiar olive drab uniforms.
So every interaction becomes a life or death test.
Every checkpoint, every patrol became an exercise in acute paranoia. The GIs were forced to use American sports trivia, or movie quotes, as makeshift passwords, because simple military challenges were completely unreliable.
Who won the World Series in 1943?
Exactly. Questions like that. The fundamental trust that's essential for basic military function. It just evaporated. It was gone.
And this pervasive distrust must have meant that the so-called rules of civilized warfare had become completely meaningless. I mean, if you can't trust the man standing next to you, how on earth can you trust an enemy who raises his hands in surrender?
You can't. The Geneva Convention, the whole international framework for the humane treatment of prisoners, it felt, as one soldier put it, like a fairy tale from a different war.
Just a piece of paper.
Just a piece of paper. The war had become an immediate personalized struggle for survival, where the concept of rules was a luxury they just couldn't afford. And on top of that, the identity of the primary enemy had narrowed significantly.
Right. They weren't just fighting the Wehrmacht anymore, the regular German army.
No, they were fighting the SS, the ideological fanatics. And the sources show a very clear distinction being drawn by the American troops. Regular German soldiers, the Wehrmacht, they might surrender, they might follow the rules. But the Waffen-SS, they had demonstrated an absolute commitment to fighting without quarter.
No surrender.
Often carrying explicit orders not to take prisoners in that initial thrust of the bulge. So they were perceived not as soldiers, but as ideological zealots who had suspended their own humanity.
And this combination, the physical misery, the existential paranoia from Operation Grief, and facing this fanatical enemy, it created what the sources call a simmering lethal rage among the American troops.
Yes, they were at a moral breaking point. They were actively looking for a reason, a justification, to stop the burdensome and frankly dangerous process of taking and securing prisoners.
Which leads us to a fundamental failure in command philosophy, right, what you call violence control. The American military doctrine seemed to assume that you could instill this aggression needed to kill and win, but at the same time maintain the legal discipline to protect prisoners.
They thought aggression was a switch.
A switch you could just flip on and off.
Precisely. They genuinely believed they could unleash the killer instincts required to survive a firefight, and then, the moment an enemy soldier raised their hands, that American GI would immediately revert to the moral standards of the Geneva Convention.
But the Ardennes proved that assumption was catastrophically wrong.
Completely wrong. The switch was fused in the on position by the combined physical and psychological stress. The moral lines, which were already tenuous, were about to be erased entirely by one single horrific event.
So the narrative back home, the official story, was that the American GI was this knight in olive drab, the moral antithesis of the Nazi forces. And the military justice system was set up to reinforce this. The field manual on the rules of land warfare was explicit. Executing a surrendered enemy was legally defined as murder.
And it carried the mandatory penalty of death. This was the official law of the U.S. Army.
It had to be.
It was the necessary projection of a democratic force fighting a total war. But the frontline reality was that the manual was just paper. The difference between a brutal firefight and a war crime was often whether a non-combatant or a senior officer was there to witness it. The foundation of this whole narrative was fragile, and it was about to be obliterated by the actions of Kampfgruppe Peiper.
Okay, so let's talk about the trigger event, Malmedy. Why did this one event shatter the American moral high ground and essentially provide the justification for future vengeance?
The date is December 17, 1944. This is just as the German offensive is achieving its deepest penetration. At around 12:30 in the afternoon, a convoy from the American 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion was traveling near the Baugnez Crossroads, near the town of Malmedy.
And these weren't frontline infantry guys, right?
No, that's a key point. They were largely support troops, artillery spotters, clerks, drivers, not battle-hardened infantry, and they ran straight into the vanguard of Kampfgruppe Peiper.
And Camp Paper was not just any SS unit. They were the spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division, commanded by Joachim Peiper, a man notorious for his ruthless efficiency and his ideological fanaticism.
Absolutely. Piper's unit was moving fast. They were under explicit orders to ignore any roadblocks or delays, and that included dealing with large numbers of prisoners. So the American convoy, realizing they were completely outgunned, outmatched, did exactly what the manual demanded.
They surrendered.
They surrendered. The SS disarmed them and herded approximately 150 Americans into a snowy, open field next to the road.
And the accounts of what happened next are crucial here because they depict something that isn't a heat-of-the-moment burst of anger. This was a calculated atrocity.
The sources confirm this chilling calculation. For reasons that are still debated, it could have been a misunderstanding, a deliberate order to clear the area, or just pure ideological malice. The SS machine guns opened fire on the assembled disarmed prisoners.
On unarmed men.
On unarmed men. The firing lasted for about 10 brutal minutes. The snow around that crossroads became saturated with American blood.
What was the final toll? And what were the details of the cruelty that ended up spreading like poison through the American lines?
The final death toll is 84 American POWs. But it was the details that truly fueled the rage. Survivors testify that after the machine gun fire stopped, SS troopers walked through the field, systematically shooting wounded men in the head at point-blank range with their pistols.
So this wasn't collateral damage. This was execution.
This was methodical execution, a cleanup job.
So playing dead was really the only chance of survival.
It was the only chance. A handful of men managed to survive by falling, lying motionless, and letting the blood of their comrades freeze onto their uniforms as a kind of camouflage. It's just horrific to imagine.
Unbelievable.
And then, under the cover of darkness, they made their way back to American lines. Their arrival? Frostbitten, traumatized, carrying this indelible image of the massacre, it acted like an electric shock to the entire Third Army.
The word Malmedy must have instantly become synonymous with the absolute brutality of the SS. It wasn't just a report, it was internalized.
It became a collective psychological injury. And this is the critical transition you have to understand. Malmedy wasn't just seen as a tragedy. It immediately morphed into a permission slip for vengeance.
A permission slip?
The unspoken order that traveled through the ranks of the Third Army was lethal and simple. The SS are not entitled to the protection of the law. They have forfeited their humanity. Therefore, the American moral constraint against killing prisoners was, in the eyes of the frontline troops, null and void.
So that simmering rage we talked about, the cold, the paranoia, it all now had a justified target. The psychological barrier to committing a war crime wasn't just breached, it was intentionally demolished by the actions of the enemy.
And Patton, who already held a profound, deep-seated hatred for the Nazi regime and its ideological troops, made absolutely no effort to curb this desire for vengeance. In fact, many of his direct and indirect statements affirmed the growing sentiment that the SS were to be treated as something less than human. The stage was now set for the inevitable retaliation.
So if Malmedy was the trigger, Chenogne was the calculated response. What distinguishes the events at Chenogne from, say, a chaotic heat-of-battle mistake? Because the sources really emphasize this was a calculated, cold-blooded, systemic reaction.
The word calculated is key. This wasn't committed by a handful of terrified, isolated men immediately after heavy combat. There was time. There was time for the men to process the news from Malmedy, for that rage to solidify into a clear intent, and for the necessary unit cohesion to form around an agreed course of action. It took 2 full weeks for this vengeance cycle to manifest.
So the date is January 1st, 1945, New Year's Day, 2 weeks after Malmedy. The location is the small village of Chenogne near Bastogne during that intense clearing operation. Which American unit was responsible?
The American 11th Armored Division. Now, this was a highly motivated division, relatively fresh, and they were tasked with a brutal clearance mission. The fighting in Chenogne itself was intense, house-to-house combat, very typical for the kind of close-quarters fighting required to eliminate those German pockets in the Ardennes.
And by the afternoon, they had secured the village and captured a pretty significant number of German soldiers. How did the Americans make sure they were targeting the right enemy, the SS, and not just regular Wehrmacht troops?
The source material is quite specific on this point. They captured approximately 60 German soldiers, and a good number of them were clearly Waffen-SS. You could identify them immediately by their distinctive camouflage fatigues and, crucially, the smoking gun. The Sig Runen, the double lightning bolt rune collar tabs that marked them as ideological SS troops.
So for the 11th Armored, seeing those runes was basically a death warrant.
It was the death warrant. These men, whether they were personally present at Malmedy or not, they represented the perpetrators. They were the SS.
They were disarmed and marched out. And this is where the deliberation, the chilling premeditation, really becomes evident. Can you detail the execution as the sources describe it?
Yes. They were marched into a snowy field just behind the village. The accounts that were collected later by the Inspector General's office are just shocking in their detail. They show a complete breakdown of moral control within the entire unit. The act was performed publicly, systematically, and with clear intent.
Oh, so.
An American machine gunner set up his tripod in the frozen mud. Now, this takes time. It requires deliberate care, as one of the reports noted. It's not a quick action. It signals an intent to commit a large-scale, premeditated killing.
This wasn't a frenzy. This was a grim logistical process.
It was an assembly line of death, precisely. The order was given, and the machine gun roared to life. The 60 prisoners were cut down in waves, their bodies collapsing into the snow. It was a mirror image of the scene at Malmedy 2 weeks prior, only this time, the victims were wearing German uniforms and the executioners were Americans.
And they made sure there were no survivors.
To ensure efficiency, those who survived the initial machine gun bursts were then systematically finished off with rifles. This speaks to a profound unit cohesion. Every man present was either an active participant or a silent consenting witness. There were no objections.
So the cycle of vengeance, which had been simmering for 2 weeks, was now complete. An entire American unit had committed a war crime of mass execution. What was the immediate implication of this act, right there on the ground?
Well, the sheer visibility of it meant it couldn't be contained. The snow was a very poor concealment for 60 bodies. It was an undeniable, tangible fact that the 11th Armored Division had crossed a line. The same men who came to Europe to be liberators had acted as executioners.
The moral high ground was gone.
Completely shattered, not by enemy propaganda, but by their own hands. And this truth, now frozen into the Belgian ground, was about to travel up the chain of command, setting up this incredible crisis for General Patton.
You mentioned the unit cohesion. To pull off a systemic execution like this, it requires more than just a few bad apples. It requires leadership complicity, or at the very minimum, a tacit understanding that the highest command would look the other way.
Absolutely. The officers commanding that unit, realizing the severity, but perhaps also the justification in their own minds, they had to ensure compliance up and down the line. It was an unspoken, collective agreement forged in the cold and the shared hatred of the SS. But the laws of war, unlike the laws of the front lines, are written in Washington, D.C., and they were about to be enforced. As soon as those bodies were discovered, the grinding bureaucracy of military law, which is designed to operate independently of the fighting commander, it swung into action. On January 2nd, 1945, the Inspector General's office, the IG's office, launched a formal inquiry.
We should pause here and just clarify the role of the Inspector General, because this is key to understanding how severe Patton's next action really was. The IG wasn't just some internal affairs department for the Third Army, was it?
No, that is a vital point. The Inspector General's office reports directly to the Chief of Staff of the Army and the Secretary of War in Washington. Its investigation into capital crimes like murder operates independently of the local field commander, in this case Patton.
So Patton couldn't just order them to stop?
He has no legal authority to do so. Only higher authority back in the States could call them off. This wasn't just a domestic police matter for his army. It was a federal legal challenge to the conduct of his men, rooted in the Articles of War.
And these investigators worked incredibly fast. They collected undeniable evidence in, 48 hours? What exactly was in that manila folder when it got to Patton?
It was absolutely damning. The investigators had collected sworn testimony from Belgian civilians who had watched the entire execution from their windows. They had secured statements from officers in other U.S. units who had seen the bodies before they could be buried. The file contained ballistic reports, forensic estimates, and clear identification of the unit involved, the 11th Armored Division.
And worse, it names names.
It did. Most ominously, the evidence named the specific American officers who had issued the order or directly overseen the execution.
And the charges that were outlined in that file, they were non-negotiable, weren't they?
Under the Articles of War, the charges of executing disarmed prisoners of war carried a mandatory penalty: death by hanging. If this went to trial, the chain of command, potentially even reaching General Patton himself, would be implicated in creating an environment where this was permissible.
So the political crisis was immediate and absolute. If this trial proceeded, it would hand Joseph Goebbels and the Nazi propaganda ministry the single greatest weapon they could possibly ask for.
It would be a propaganda catastrophe, a complete disaster. Goebbels would flood the world with the details. The American liberators are the true murderers. They slaughter disarmed men. It would completely undermine the Allied narrative of the good war. It could even rally a desperate German population to fight even harder against what would be framed as hypocritical invaders.
So the entire moral standing of the Allied cause rested inside that one thick manila folder.
In a very real sense, yes.
And that folder lands on Patton's desk on January 4th. So we return to that stone room in Luxembourg. The atmosphere is quiet. You can hear the logs snapping in the fire. The major from the Inspector General's office presents the file, rigid with apprehension. He's expecting the general's legendary temper.
But Patton's reaction isn't anger. It is a cold, calculated control. Patton then walks over to the fireplace. The intense orange light is casting these long, unstable shadows on the stone walls. He picks up the file. You can imagine him feeling the weight of it, the weight of the evidence, the weight of the legal jeopardy for his men, and the weight of this moral dilemma. He looks that top-secret stamp one last time. He knows the political and legal consequences of acting, but he also knows the tactical consequences of not acting.
And then the verdict. And it's not delivered through a court-martial order. It's delivered through a single dismissive statement.
He delivers the now infamous damning quote that supersedes the entire American military legal framework in that one moment.
Oh.
There are no snipers in this army, Patton says, using the word snipers as a kind of shorthand for any unauthorized, disciplined killing. And then he says, and I won't have my men prosecuted for killing the sons of bitches who killed our boys.
And the obstruction of justice couldn't be clearer. He takes the entire file, the sworn testimony, the ballistics, the names of the accused officers, and he tosses it into the roaring fire.
The paper instantly catches. It curls, it blackens, it turns to ash with shocking speed. The justice system, the entire investigative effort, the legal proof of an American war crime, it literally goes up the chimney in a wisp of gray smoke. It is a visible, unambiguous act of high command committing a felony to bury a truth.
And the major, a man whose entire career is defined by rules and procedure, he just stands there, absolutely frozen. He has just witnessed the highest-ranking officer in the theater suspend the rule of law. If he speaks, his career is over. If he leaves, the crime is buried, and he's implicated by his silence.
His only option is silence. The major executes this stiff, almost mechanical salute, pivots, and leaves the room without another word. Patton watches the last embers die out. The whole atmosphere in that stone room instantly changes from one of tension to one of shared secrecy.
It's a conspiracy.
It is. Patton's aide, who is also present, moves to pour the general the drink, and the sources note his hand was visibly trembling as the glass clinked against the decanter. He, too, is now bound by this knowledge.
So outside that heavy oak door, the Third Army is fighting for the rule of law and democracy. But inside that room, the law has been suspended by the will of one man. Patton, his aide, and the major who just left are now tied together in this conspiratorial pact that would ensure the truth of Chenogne remained buried for decades.
So now we have to move beyond the dramatic act itself and really analyze the strategic, if morally abhorrent, rationale behind Patton's decision.
Correct.
Why would a general who is famous for his stringent discipline, I mean, this is the same man who notoriously slapped shell-shocked soldiers for perceived cowardice, why would he actively protect men who committed mass murder?
The sources all suggest his rationale was not legal. It wasn't ethical. It was purely psychological and tactical, and it was rooted in his very particular view of the conflict.
Precisely. Patton fundamentally viewed the war not as some nuanced legal dispute that was subject to the Articles of War. He saw it as an existential, immediate tribal struggle for survival against an ideological enemy he absolutely loathed. And in that context, the law was secondary to the tactical objective, which was winning the war now.
And his command calculus was famously brutal. Morale over law. The 11th Armored Division had just successfully cleared Chenogne. They were a fresh, aggressive, and highly capable unit. What was their immediate tactical value at that moment?
Oh, their value was immense. The Battle of the Bulge was not over. It was actually pivoting from a desperate defense to a counterattack.
Yeah.
Patton needed every single ounce of momentum he could get. And the 11th Armored was slated to be sent right back into the meat grinder immediately to maintain pressure on the retreating German lines.
So he needed them aggressive, lethal, and fearless.
Above all, fearless.
So let's play this out. If he had chosen to prosecute, what would have been the immediate military cost?
The cost would have been twofold and immediate. First, you'd be pulling the officers, the entire leadership structure of a major armored division, out for a capital murder trial. That would have crippled the unit's effectiveness at the exact moment they were most needed.
Yeah.
You just don't send a leadership vacuum into a major counteroffensive.
Okay, that's the practical cost. What about the psychological one?
That was perhaps more important to Patton. He believed that court-martialing those officers would break the spirit of the division.
Explain that. What does that mean, break the spirit?
Well, think about the message it would have sent. It would signal to every single soldier in the Third Army that their high command cared more about upholding legal abstractions and protecting dead German SS troops than it did about protecting the mental and emotional security of their own living American soldiers who were still out there fighting these fanatics in sub-zero temperatures.
So the men would feel betrayed.
Betrayed. And if they felt that their actions against this hated enemy were suddenly criminalized, they would lose that vital killer instinct that Patton believed he needed to push the counterattack and win the war.
This sounds like a deliberate strategic dehumanization of the enemy, and it was necessary to maintain the fighting edge of his own troops.
It was absolutely a strategic dehumanization. Patton had this deep, visceral hatred for the SS, and it was amplified 100-fold by the Malmedy atrocities. To him, the executed SS men at Chenogne were mad dogs. They weren't soldiers entitled to legal protection. The law applied only to civilized combatants, and in his mind, the SS had opted out of civilization.
You know, we see a parallel here to that earlier controversy when Patton slapped the shell-shocked soldiers in Sicily. That incident, while it resulted in a public reprimand for him, it was also rooted in this ruthless prioritization of command stability and morale, regardless of the accepted rules.
That is a crucial connection to make. In both instances, the slapping incident and the Chenogne cover-up Patton acted unilaterally to enforce his vision of command, a vision focused on mental toughness and tactical aggression, even if it meant violating military law or conventional standards of decency. In the case of Chenogne, erasing the massacre was, in his view, a necessary act of command.
So it was a cold, tactical decision made with a moral blindfold. The psychological readiness of his men just trumped the long-term integrity of the American legal system.
That's it, exactly.
Yeah.
So he wasn't just hiding a crime. He was essentially issuing a license for future brutal efficiency. He wanted his men to know, without a doubt, that he had provided them cover for the worst things they had to do to win.
The unspoken policy became, against the SS, anything goes.
Anything goes. He chose his men over the rule of law, ensuring they went back into the fight with zero inhibition about taking prisoners. That decision gave his division an immediate, brutal psychological edge, but it came at an astronomical moral cost that they and the Army would carry long after the war was over.
So the tactical consequences of Patton's action, they were immediate and they were tangible. The smoke cleared from the fireplace in Luxembourg and the investigation just evaporated.
It vanished. No arrests were made. No MPs showed up at the 11th Armored's headquarters. The officers named in that file simply returned to their tanks unpunished and clearly protected from on high.
And the message immediately traveled down the chain of command, not through official orders, but through rumor and, maybe more powerfully, through silence.
The message was clear. The old man has our back. And with that, the psychological inhibition against killing prisoners, it just vanished entirely for the 11th Armored Division.
And the sources confirm this led to a very observable, very brutal shift in their conduct on the battlefield.
It absolutely did. The fighting conducted by the 11th Armored Division for the rest of the campaign was noted by military historians as being particularly savage. If German soldiers tried to surrender to the 11th Armored, they were often just told to keep running.
Which was a death sentence.
Death sentence. The fear of being taken prisoner by the Americans, at least in that sector, now began to match the fear of being taken prisoner by the SS.
The cost of that moral pass, though, must have been profound for the men themselves. I mean, they came to Europe as liberators, but they were given a pass to be executioners.
The moral fallout was corrosive. The stain of Chenogne wasn't something that was easily washed away. It settled deep into the fabric of the unit, creating this dark, unspoken bond among men who knew they had collectively gotten away with capital murder. They had achieved brutal efficiency, yes, but it came at the expense of their moral compass, and it was encouraged by their own commanding general.
And this one act of destruction, tossing that file into the fire, it fundamentally dictated how history would be written for the next 50 years. It established the narrative of victor's justice.
Absolutely. For decades, history reflected Patton's fire. The American public was, and largely remains, very aware of the Malmedy Massacre. It became famous. It resulted in the prosecution of SS Commander Joachim Peiper at the Dachau trials. Malmedy fit the clean moral narrative perfectly. The brutal Nazis massacred the innocent Americans. Peiper became the definitive villain.
But Chenogne just vanished, wiped from the record.
It became a historical ghost story. It was, quote, whispered by veterans at reunions, but never spoken of in public or written about in official histories. There were no trials, no prosecution, no official condemnation. The 11th Armored Division was celebrated as heroes of the Bulge, their dark secrets successfully buried in the ashes of Patton's fireplace.
And this action establishes an incredibly dangerous precedent for a nation that's supposedly founded on the rule of law. It proved that war crimes are only prosecuted when you lose. If you win, and if your general is powerful enough, mass murder simply becomes a logistical footnote to victory.
The principle of victor's justice suggests that the laws of war are conditional, that they're dependent upon the power and the will of the commanding officer. The full, documented truth only began to emerge decades later, once classified archives were finally opened, and the veterans, now old men, began to speak before their deaths. This entire chain of events constitutes a permanent blemish on the legacy of the good war. It illustrates the difficult reality that even those fighting for liberation are subject to the corrosive power of violence.
Patton, the man who saved the Third Army, chose to protect the tactical reality of war over the long-term strategic integrity of the American legal system. He saved the soldiers of the 11th Armored from the hangman's noose on January 4th, 1945.
Yes, he did. But he couldn't save them from their memories. The fire in his office destroyed the paper evidence, but it couldn't burn the image of those 60 men dying in the snow out of the minds of the man who pulled the triggers. That cost, the moral weight of complicity, is the true, unburnable legacy of Chenogne.
So this deep dive, it really forces us to confront this central conflict. War is rarely the clean fight between absolute good and absolute evil that we prefer to remember. It is a descent into a kind of primal madness where, under extreme pressure, even the best men can do the worst things. Patton's deliberate act of obstruction ensured the tactical victory, but the moral cost remains, well, unquantifiable.
The fire didn't purify the war. It just hid the cost of victory. As we look at the American cemeteries and honor the sacrifice of those who fought, we also have to remember that the line between hero and villain is often drawn in ash, and sometimes it's drawn by the hand of the hero himself.
So what does it mean for us today when the heroes we worship are also the men who hold the lighter? What are the long-term costs to a democracy when its greatest wartime generals are allowed to unilaterally suspend the rule of law, even for what they see as a tactical advantage? That is something critical for you to consider as you reflect on the complexities of the good war until our next deep dive into hidden front history.